Middle-aged cowboy thought he'd be alone forever, until four Apache women begged for just one night. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Cold evening air spread across the open land as the sun lowered behind the hills, turning the sky into a wide stretch of fading orange and gray. Cole ran across the yard with a slow, steady pace, each step marked by a faint hitch in his right leg. The limp had been with him for years, a result of an old injury from a job he no longer spoke about. He carried a bucket of water toward the trough, breathing in the sharp scent of dry dirt and cooling metal from the barn roof. The quiet around him was familiar, almost heavy, but he had grown used to living without voices, footsteps, or anyone else's routine shaping his own. Cole had been alone for nearly a decade. Once a hired gun who drifted from job to job, he retired when the work hollowed him out more than any injury ever had. He bought this small ranch to keep his hands busy and his mind controlled, fixing fences, tending two horses, repairing gear. None of it required explanations. None of it required trust. The last time he had let someone close, the cost had left a mark that still made him wake at night with a tight chest and a dry mouth. Living quiet had seemed safer. As he set the bucket down, something shifted along the ridge. It wasn't a horse. The movement was too slow, too uneven. Cole stopped and looked harder. For figures walked in a thin line, spacing between them just wide enough to suggest caution. Their steps dragged. They held no visible weapons. Their posture showed fatigue that came from traveling too long without food or rest. He straightened and waited, jaw tightening slightly, his instincts from old days returning without permission. He wasn't afraid, just alert. The figures reached the edge of his yard. When they stepped closer, he saw their clothes, torn skirts, worn leggings, shawls frayed from wind and sand. Their skin showed the rough traces of long travel. Cracked lips, dirt smudged across cheekbones, hair matted at the ends. They were Apache women, widows by the look of their expressions and the absence of men with them. Cole saw grief in their eyes before anyone spoke, a kind he recognized from the quiet nights he spent alone after witnessing too much loss in his past. The tallest woman stepped forward. She stood straight, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her voice, when it came, was steady but strained. "We need shelter for one night," she said. She didn't explain who they were running from. She didn't reveal where they came from. She simply stated the request with a kind of controlled dignity that caught Cole off guard. The silent seconds afterward carried tension. The other women waited behind her. One of them, shorter, with soft features and trembling hands, clutched a bundle to her chest. Another, taller with a tense jawline, watched Cole as if ready to protect the others at a moment's notice. The youngest kept her gaze low, blinking slowly like someone fighting sleep. Cole felt the old familiar tug of decision-making settle into him, the same feeling he used to get before agreeing to a dangerous job. But this moment was different. He wasn't deciding whether to fight, track, or defend. He was deciding whether to open his door to four strangers who clearly carried more than hunger. They carried fear. They carried the weight of someone chasing them. The idea of turning them away tightened something in his chest. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. The women climbed the porch steps slowly. Their knees trembled from cold. When Cole pushed the door open, warm air from the stove drifted toward them. They entered hesitantly, their eyes scanning the small single-room house. Everything inside was simple: a cot to the left, a rough table in the center, shelves of tools and blankets stacked near the back wall. Cole closed the door behind them and stayed near the entrance, giving them space. He wasn't sure what they expected from him. He wasn't sure what he was ready to offer beyond the basics. Still, he walked to the stove, lifted the lid off the pot of leftover stew, and placed it on the table. He set down 5 chip bowls and stepped back again. He didn't try to reassure them. He didn't ask questions. He believed people who had walked this far didn't need interrogating. They needed warmth and a place to sit without looking over their shoulders. The women approached the table with caution. Their movements were stiff, their hands shaking slightly as they scooped food. The sound of spoons tapping against bowls echoed softly through the room. The leader, he would later learn her name was Taya, watched him between bites, not with suspicion, but with careful calculation. Cole met her eyes once, then looked away, not wanting to intrude. Taya's expression revealed pieces of her story without words. She had been protecting the others, making decisions, carrying more responsibility than one person should. He recognized the tension in her jaw, the kind that came from choosing survival over rest again and again. Another woman, the one with the soft features, let out a long breath once warmth reached her stomach. The tall one remained alert, glancing at the windows and door with the same instinct Cole had developed over years of dangerous work. The youngest, barely older than 20, sat close to the wall and wrapped her arms around herself as the cold lifted from her bones. Cole pulled a bedroll toward the stove and lowered himself onto it. The flame cast a faint glow across his scarred knuckles and worn boots. The weight of the day pressed on him, but he didn't close his eyes. He listened, for new rhythms of breathing filled the room. Not steady yet, but no longer desperate. It struck him how long it had been since he'd shared space with another soul. A part of him felt uneasy, not from danger, but from change. Another part felt something he hadn't experienced in years, purpose. He didn't know their mission yet, but he sensed it was more than escaping hunger. The way they carried themselves suggested a deeper threat, something unresolved that would eventually reach his land. He didn't know why they had chosen his ranch. He didn't know if he was prepared for what their presence would bring. But he felt a pull he didn't expect, a quiet responsibility forming around them. The wind rattled the shutters. Taya watched the movement with a tense jaw before finally allowing her shoulders to lower. The others followed her shift, settling into the safety of the room. Cole stared at the ceiling, the warmth of the fire reaching his hands. For the first time in years, the silence in his home felt different. No longer empty, no longer echoing off the walls. And though he didn't admit it aloud, he knew this night marked a turn in his life he hadn't looked for but couldn't ignore. Morning arrived without warning, spreading a pale gray light across the yard as the first chill of early dawn pushed through the cracks in the wooden walls. Cole Rannick woke before the women did, lying still on the bedroll he had set near the stove. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim interior. The fire had burned low, leaving only a faint glow under the blackened logs. His back ached from the hard floor, but he ignored it and listened instead. Soft breaths, 4 different rhythms, filled the quiet house. None were panicked. None were strained. Each one sounded more relaxed than the night before, which told him they had needed rest far more than they had dared say. Cole pushed himself up carefully so he wouldn't disturb them. He stood, slipped into his boots, and moved to the door with measured steps. Outside, the air bit at his cheeks, and frost clung to the fence railings like thin white paint. He stepped down from the porch, testing his weight on his injured leg. The cold tightened the joint, but he walked through it with practiced patience. The horses stirred in the corral, their breath rising in faint clouds. Cole checked the gate, added a handful of feed to each trough, and rubbed the muzzle of the older gelding. As he worked, he thought about the women inside, why they were on foot, why they had risked traveling across open country, why none had mentioned husbands or tribes or plans. He didn't expect answers, but he knew their arrival was not random. When he returned to the porch, he found Taya standing at the threshold. She hadn't made a sound, yet she was fully awake, hair braided loosely down her back, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes scanned the yard with careful precision, as if studying the land for threats rather than scenery. Cole paused a few steps away, giving her space. She didn't look frightened. She looked ready, ready for the day, ready for whatever might come next, ready to get her bearings after being forced into survival mode for too long. "You can come out if you want," Cole said quietly, voice rough from sleep. Taya stepped onto the porch, her bare feet touching the cold boards as she kept the blanket tight around her. She didn't answer him directly, but her gaze moved across the horizon, then down to the corral. She watched the horses for a moment and exhaled in a way that suggested she was grounding herself. The door behind her opened slightly, and Nomi peeked out. Her expression was softer, less guarded. She blinked against the cold, then stepped outside wearing a patched shawl over her dress. A faint tremor passed through her hands, but she held steady as she took in the quiet land. Sani followed soon after, her tall frame filling the doorway, her posture rigid with vigilance. Lyra came last, rubbing her arms for warmth, eyes still heavy from sleep. Cole didn't crowd them. He leaned against the porch post and let them take in the space. A person needed a moment to understand where they had landed after a long stretch of fear. Inside, he lit the stove again and set a pot of water to heat. The women came back in one by one, drawn by the warmth. Cole prepared a simple breakfast, oats and boiled water, and placed 5 bowls on the table. He sat at the far end so they wouldn't feel cornered. As they ate, the house settled into a different kind of quiet. The tension from last night had eased, replaced by something fragile but noticeable, a small sense of safety. Taya finished her bowl slowly. When she set it down, she spoke for the first time since the previous night. "We didn't plan to stop here," she said, "but we needed to choose a place before dark." Cole met her gaze without pressing her for details. "You can stay through the day," he replied. "Weather's cold. You need time to gather yourselves." Sani's eyes narrowed slightly, not from suspicion, but from puzzling out his intentions. She studied him the way a seasoned scout studies the terrain. Cole didn't mind. Trust wasn't owed, it was earned. Lyra reached for a second helping, but paused, as if expecting permission. Cole nudged the pot toward her. Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment, but she took the food, her shoulders loosening as she ate. After breakfast, the women moved carefully around the space, trying not to intrude. Nomi folded blankets. Lyra cleaned the bowls. Sani checked the windows and corners, learning the structure of the house. Taya stood in the doorway, watching Cole as he stepped out to chop wood. He swung the axe with controlled force, the sound of each strike breaking the stillness. Taya watched long enough to understand his rhythm before she came closer and picked up a fallen piece of bark to clear the ground. She moved with purpose, not seeking praise, but simply contributing. "You don't have to help," Cole said without looking up. "We should," Taya replied. "We're using your space." Her voice held no apology, only practicality. He respected that. Sani joined soon after, stacking the split logs with strong, methodical movements. Nomi swept the porch with a small brush she found near the door. Lyra approached the corral, stopping at a safe distance as she observed the horses with careful curiosity. The ranch, usually silent and still, filled with slow but steady activity. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. The presence of these women changed the atmosphere, not loudly, but unquestionably. Cole paused when he saw Taya studying the horizon again. She wasn't admiring the land. She was tracking something in her mind: routes, dangers, unfinished business. Whatever had driven them here hadn't yet resolved. He didn't ask, but he felt the weight of their situation pressing closer. As the sun climbed, Taya finally spoke again, her voice low. "We're not sure how long we can stay on the move." Cole listened without interrupting. Her words weren't a request yet, but they pointed in that direction. She continued, "We left behind everything we knew. We don't plan to cause trouble." He tightened his grip on the axe handle. "Trouble finds people without asking," he said quietly. Taya held his gaze for a long moment. Her eyes didn't show fear now, only exhaustion mixed with determination. Inside the house, Lyra laughed softly at something Nomi said, the sound brief and fragile, but unmistakably hopeful. Cole turned back to the woodpile, knowing what he wasn't ready to say aloud yet. Their arrival wasn't a random stop. The land had brought them here, and he was beginning to understand that his quiet life was no longer going to remain untouched. The morning stretched into a colder, steadier light as clouds thickened above the ranch, muting every color on the land. Cole Rannick stepped out with a coil of rope over his shoulder, intending to check the west fence before the wind picked up. The air held a damp heaviness that hinted at coming weather, and the horses moved restlessly in their pen, shaking their manes as if sensing the shift before he did. Before he reached the barn, He noticed Lyra standing near the corral gate. She didn't approach. She watched him with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity. Her hair hung loosely, brushed through but still tangled at the ends from travel. When she saw him glance her way, she straightened, as though embarrassed to be seen standing idle. She raised her hand slightly toward the horses, nodding once, asking permission without words. Cole gave a short gesture toward the mare closest to the fence. Lyra stepped forward with slow confidence, not bold but steady. The mare sniffed her fingers and relaxed almost instantly. Lyra's shoulders loosened at the reaction as she stroked the animal's neck with careful, practiced movements. Cole noted the familiarity in her touch. She wasn't new to horses. Whatever life she had lived before this, it had included work that required quiet patience. While Lyra tended to the mare, Cole entered the barn to gather a hammer and nails. The door creaked as he stepped out again, and this time Sonny stood several paces away, arms folded, eyes scanning the tree line. She wasn't watching the ranch. She was watching for anything that didn't belong. Cole had seen that look on scouts and ex-soldiers. A person who didn't allow themselves to believe danger was over just because the night passed. "You expecting someone?" Cole asked, his tone neutral. Sonny shook her head slightly, just making sure nothing followed us. He didn't press. The stiffness in her voice made it clear she wasn't ready to explain. Instead, he walked toward the far end of the fence. Moments later, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, Taya joined him, stopping at a respectful distance. She carried herself with deliberate composure, though her eyes showed she hadn't slept deeply. "I'll help," she said simply. Cole handed her a spare pair of gloves. She put them on without hesitation. Together, they inspected the fence, moving in unspoken rhythm. He hammered loose boards back into place. Taya cleared branches and debris from the base, occasionally glancing toward the creek as if expecting movement there. Her awareness wasn't nervous, it was practiced, someone who had learned not to trust quiet landscapes. As they worked, Cole stole a few brief looks at her expression. Taya wasn't fragile. She wasn't intimidated by the land or by him. But there was exhaustion in her eyes that hadn't eased yet, a battle she hadn't explained but carried silently. When they reached the section closest to the creek, Taya paused. Kneeling, she brushed away a patch of disturbed soil. Her face tightened with concentration. "What is it?" Cole asked. "A track," she murmured. "Old, but not from us." Cole crouched beside her. The imprint was faint, nearly erased by wind and wildlife, but it wasn't one of his. He felt a moment of pressure in his chest. Not fear, but recognition that their presence hadn't gone unnoticed after all. "How long?" Cole asked quietly. "2, maybe 3 days," Taya replied. "Hard to tell. The rain last night changed the edges." He stood slowly. The air around them felt heavier, though nothing moved in the trees. Back at the house, Nomi had warmed water over the stove. The smell of broth drifted through the doorway. She looked up when they entered, her face carrying a hint of relief that they had returned without trouble. Lyra joined them soon after, cheeks flushed from being outside, the horsehair clinging lightly to her sleeves. Sonny stayed close to the front window, watching the creek area from a different angle. She was tense, but not in a way that made the room feel unsafe. More like someone who refused to let surprise overtake them again. Cole set the hammer on the table. "There's a track by the creek," he said calmly. He didn't raise his voice or add threat to the statement. The truth alone changed the room. Nomi stopped stirring the broth. Lyra lowered herself onto a chair, gripping the edge lightly. Taya didn't show fear. She absorbed the information as if confirming a suspicion she already held. Sonny didn't look away from the window. "It might be nothing," Cole added. "Could be a ranch hand passing through weeks ago." Taya shook her head. "No ranch hand walks through that stretch. The ground is too soft. People avoid it unless they're hiding their path." Cole processed that detail carefully. He didn't want to assume danger, but Taya's certainty came from experience, not guesswork. "You're being hunted," he said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Sonny finally turned from the window. Her jaw tightened. We left someone behind who doesn't accept no as an answer. If he finds our trail, he won't stop. Nomi swallowed, her breath catching. Lyra stared at the floor, her fingers tensing around the fabric of her dress. Taya lifted her chin, her voice controlled. We didn't come here to pull you into our trouble. We just needed a place to breathe. Cole didn't respond immediately. He understood the pull of past violence, the way it followed a person like a shadow. He had lived through years of it. He knew running never stayed simple. You're safe for now, he said finally. We'll watch the land together. Relief didn't flood their faces, but something shifted. A new steadiness settled into the room, the kind that came from knowing someone wasn't turning away even after hearing the truth. The day continued with quiet work. Nomi prepared food. Lyra brushed the horses again. Sani walked the yard's perimeter to learn every angle. Taya carried wood inside, her steps heavy but controlled. Cole watched them move through his space, not as intruders, not as guests, but as people trying to rebuild a life step by cautious step. For the first time in years, his ranch felt less like a place meant only for isolation, and more like the beginning of something he hadn't been searching for but couldn't stop from taking shape. The sky darkened earlier than usual that afternoon, heavy clouds stacking over the hills until the land fell into a muted, shadowed calm. A cold wind pushed across the ranch, carrying the smell of distant rain and settling unease into every quiet corner. Cole Rannick tightened the collar of his coat as he finished tying a new rope to the barn support beam. The air felt different today, thicker, quieter, as if the land itself sensed something approaching. He didn't voice the thought, but he felt it in the prickling tension at the back of his neck. Inside the house, Taya sorted the tools they had gathered earlier, placing each one on the table with a level of precision Cole recognized from people who had been forced to control every detail of their surroundings. She paused whenever the wind slammed against the shutters, not in fear, but in readiness. Her alertness wasn't fading with rest. It was sharpening as she regained strength. Nomi moved quietly between the stove and the counter, her concentration fixed on preparing a small batch of cornbread. She wasn't humming today. Her hands shook slightly whenever the shutter rattled, her nerves still sensitive after months of running. She tried to hide it by moving faster, but the tremor lingered. Sani remained outside longer than the others, walking an extended perimeter around the ranch with deliberate steps. Each time she reached a corner of the property, she stopped, surveyed the distant ridges, then continued. When she finally returned to the porch, her expression was tight but not panicked. She had seen no intruders, yet she didn't trust the emptiness. Lyra stayed close to the horses again, brushing out their manes with slow, even strokes. She spoke softly to them in her native language, almost inaudible, but the animals responded with calm movements. The hard lines around her eyes had softened since arriving, but she still flinched whenever a loud gust crossed the corral. Cole walked up to the fence where she worked. "They take you easy," he said. Lyra looked up with cautious pride. "Horses don't lie," she answered quietly. "They don't hide their fear." That truth struck Cole deeper than he expected. People hid everything. Horses didn't. He left Lyra to her work and crossed the yard toward Taya, who stood near the house holding a broken latch she had found loose on the back window. She lifted it slightly. "This won't hold if someone pushes hard enough." Cole examined the piece. The wood along the edge had rotted, something he hadn't paid attention to recently. Solitude had made him careless in areas he'd once inspected often. "I'll fix it now," he said. "I'll hold the board in place," Taya replied. Inside, the two worked at the back window. Cole positioned the new wooden brace, and Taya pressed it against the wall with steady hands. Their faces were close enough that he could see faint lines of exhaustion on her forehead, marks of too many nights spent waiting for footsteps outside her previous shelters. He hammered in the new hinges, each strike echoing through the room. While they worked, Nomi checked the pot on the stove and said softly, "We didn't expect anyone to help us again." Cole paused, surprised by her calm honesty. "You needed a place," he said. "That's all. That's more than we've had in a long time," she whispered, not looking at him. Sani stepped inside, just then, brushing dirt from her hands. I saw nothing around the property, she said, her tone controlled. But the feeling hasn't left. No tracks? Cole asked. None, she replied. But absence doesn't mean safety. Lyra entered behind her, bringing a gust of cold air with her. The horses are uneasy, she said. Not spooked, just restless. The room quieted. Each woman exchanged a glance, not of panic, but of acknowledgement. They trusted signs from the land more than words. Cole folded his arms. If anything comes, we'll see it before it reaches the house. Taya studied him carefully. You speak like someone who's been hunted. He didn't deny it. Everyone has a past, he said, and I've lived mine long enough to know danger never announces itself. She accepted the answer with a slight nod, not pushing for details he didn't offer. As evening settled deeper, Nomi served the cornbread with a simple stew she'd put together. The meal was quiet but warm. For the first time, Sani sat without keeping her hand near the knife on the table. Lyra laughed at a small joke Nomi whispered to her. Taya watched the room with a cautious hope forming behind her stern expression. Cole ate slowly, observing each of them without letting his gaze linger too long. He wasn't used to sharing a table, and the realization tightened something inside him. Not discomfort, but a weight he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't responsible for these women, yet he couldn't shake the instinct to protect the fragile sense of peace beginning to form here. After the meal, the wind softened, though the clouds above remained thick. Cole stepped out onto the porch, boots hitting the boards with a dull thud. The cold pressed immediately against his skin. He scanned the tree line with experienced eyes, searching for silhouettes, shadows, movement that didn't belong. The door opened behind him. Taya stepped out, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't stand beside him. She stood slightly behind him, as if trying not to intrude, but unable to stay inside while uncertainty lingered. It feels different tonight, she said quietly. Cole didn't look at her, but his voice matched the seriousness in hers. It does. Do you regret letting us in? She asked, her tone steady but edged with something vulnerable. No, he answered without hesitation. But I want to understand what you're carrying. Taya took a slow breath, the cold fogging in front of her. We'll tell you soon. Just not yet. He accepted that. She wasn't refusing trust. She was trying to protect it. Behind them, through the doorway, the warm glow of lantern light cast their shadows across the porch. Two people who had lived through different kinds of danger stood side by side, neither naming the fear that hovered over the land, neither walking away from it. The clouds tightened above the ranch, promising a turning point neither of them could yet see. A thin layer of frost covered the ground when the first light seeped into the valley. The cold cut sharper than the day before, settling into the earth the way a warning settles into a person's gut. Cole Rannick stepped outside before the sun had fully risen, pulling his coat tighter as the air bit at the scars on his arms. A dark line of breath escaped him as he reached the boundary near the creek. He planned to check the ground again, not out of paranoia, but out of the quiet certainty that yesterday's unease had not been misplaced. The grass bowed under his boots as he moved toward the far post. When he crouched beside the edge of the washed soil, he saw it instantly. A clearer footprint than yesterday, pressed deep enough that the rain hadn't erased it. Someone had passed through again, more recently. Cole ran a hand along the edge of the print, feeling the cold shape beneath his fingertips. Whoever had weight, purpose, and no concern about leaving a trail. He straightened slowly, the early light sharpening the tension across his shoulders. Behind him, footsteps approached with a steady, alert rhythm. Taya emerged from the fading shadows of the house, her blanket pulled tight around her, but her expression fully awake. She looked at his face first, not the ground, immediately sensing the shift. You found something, she said, voice low. Fresh track, Cole replied. Not from any ranch hand. Not from my land. Taya stepped closer and examined the print beside him. She swallowed hard, the movement small but telling. She knew exactly what it meant. He didn't press for details. Instead, he waited for her assessment. He's closing in, she said quietly. He travels faster than us. He always has. Cole heard the strain beneath her calm exterior. Fear didn't control her, but it lived close enough to shape her decisions. She wasn't describing a stranger. She was describing someone who had taken something from her group, someone who believed pursuit was a right, not an effort. "We won't outrun him here," Taya added. "But we can make it harder." Cole nodded, his mind already shifting into preparation. It wasn't the first time he had been forced to think ahead of danger. They returned to the house together. Inside, Sonny stood near the window, restless from the unsettled morning. Her eyes jumped instantly to Cole's expression. "What happened?" she asked, tension thick in her voice. Cole answered plainly. "Someone passed through after the rain." Nomi stopped drying a bowl. Lyra's hand froze mid-comb through her hair. The atmosphere changed in an instant, like a wire drawn tight. Sonny's jaw locked. "He's tracking us." Taya shot her a firm glance, warning her not to spiral. "We don't know it's him," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Cole didn't interrupt their exchange. Instead, he walked to the supply shelf and gathered tools he hadn't needed in years. The widows watched without speaking. When he returned to the table with a hammer, nails, and 2 lengths of chain, Taya shifted closer. "What are you planning?" she asked. "Reinforcement," Cole replied. "I'll secure the barn doors, check the gate hinges, and brace the back window from the outside." "And we?" Sonny asked. Cole looked at each of them, not with authority, but with clarity. "You help where you feel steady. If you're tired, you rest. If you're unsure, you stay near the house." No one goes past the corral without saying so. Their faces tightened not from resistance, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being included in decision-making rather than ordered. Taya stepped forward. "We'll do our share." Work began immediately. Nomi fetched buckets of fresh water and placed them inside near the door, her hands trembling only at the start. Lyra cleared debris from around the barn, stacking broken branches so the ground would show footprints clearly. Sonny walked the perimeter again, this time counting her paces and marking where the earth was softest. Cole inspected the barn doors and attached the first chain while wind rolled through the yard in sharp bursts. Taya followed him to the back of the house where the window frame had loosened. She held the boards while he hammered each nail with controlled strength. Their breath rose in short clouds. Neither spoke until he finished the last nail. "You've done this before," she said quietly. He answered truthfully. "I've seen places fall apart because no one acted soon enough." That made her pause. She studied his profile as he adjusted the final hinge. His silence wasn't empty. It came from someone who had lived through violence and built walls to keep it at bay. Inside, Nomi set food on the table, plain bread, beans, and warm water. The simplicity didn't matter. The gesture did. When Cole entered, she offered him a bowl without waiting for permission. He accepted it with a nod, and some of the strain in her shoulders softened. Everyone ate standing, too restless to sit. No one spoke about leaving. No one discussed running again. The unspoken decision settled in the room. They would not abandon the ranch because fear approached. They would prepare, remain alert, and hold ground together. After the meal, Cole stepped onto the porch. Taya followed, but she kept a few steps behind him, giving him space to think. He leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the distant ridge. The tension in his jaw pulsed, an old habit returning, one he thought he'd buried with his former life. Taya watched his face carefully. "You're not doing this just for us," she said. "No," Cole replied. "This is my land. I won't let danger cross it without being seen." She nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with clarity. He wasn't just a man giving shelter anymore. She wasn't just a traveler hoping for safety. Their choices were now tied to the same outcome. Inside, Sonny shut the shutters one by one. Lyra fed the horses extra hay to keep them calm through the night. Nomi folded blankets near the stove, arranging them in case someone needed to sleep fully clothed. The ranch no longer felt like a place they were visiting. It felt like a position being defended. When Cole finally turned toward Taya, the seriousness in his voice held no hesitation. "If he comes here," he said, "we'll face him together." Taya inhaled sharply, not in fear, but in unexpected relief. For the first time in a long time, Someone was choosing to stand with them instead of pushing them away. And that single truth changed everything about the hours that would follow. The sun rose behind a thin curtain of haze the next morning, casting a washed-out glow over the ranch. The cold lingered like a stubborn presence, slipping through seams in the house and settling across the yard. Cole Rennick stepped outside before the women woke, wanting a head start on the day's work. He carried a lantern and his old field knife, scanning the property with the sharp awareness he once relied on to stay alive during dangerous jobs. His jaw tightened as he approached the boundary where he had seen the prints. The ground was still untouched from last night. No new disturbances, no signs of movement. But the absence didn't settle him. It only deepened the uncertainty. Behind him, the door opened with a soft creak. Sonny stepped onto the porch, her long hair tied back tightly, her posture already alert though the morning had barely begun. She didn't greet him. She simply joined him at the edge of the yard, eyes narrowing as she surveyed the hills. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. "Didn't feel right," Cole replied. Sonny nodded, once in understanding. For the first time, her expression held something other than guarded tension. She respected preparedness. Inside, Nomi stoked the stove, adding small logs until the flames burned steady. The warmth eased her shaking hands, but worry sat beneath her ribs in a way she couldn't hide. She moved with deliberate care, setting out cups, laying blankets over the chairs, tidying corners that didn't need tidying. Keeping busy kept her from thinking too far ahead. Lyra stepped out a moment later, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She walked toward the corral with slow, careful steps, checking each horse with a tenderness that made even the skittish gelding lower its head to her palm. Her connection to the animals had grown stronger each day, grounding her in ways she didn't fully understand. The horses gave her something stable to hold on to, something that didn't judge or demand. Taya was last to emerge from the house. She carried herself with a strength that hadn't been present when she first arrived. Her shoulders set square, her face clear of exhaustion despite the long night. She approached Cole, stopping beside him without asking what he had found. "Same prints?" she asked. "No new ones," Cole said. "But quiet isn't always good." Taya studied his face. "People like him know when to wait. He doesn't rush. He just closes in until there's nowhere left to run." Cole didn't flinch at the truth of her words. If he's hiding, he'll show himself when he thinks you're worn down. That's how men like that work. Taya inhaled slowly, the cold air filling her lungs in a steadying breath. "He expects us to be alone. Weak. Easy. Then let him be wrong," Cole said. They returned to the house where the others waited. The room felt heavier than yesterday, not with fear, but with the weight of decisions approaching. Cole laid out a few tools on the table: rope, nails, 2 sharpened stakes, and a coil of wire he hadn't touched in years. Sonny crossed her arms, eyes narrowing as she examined the items. "What do you need us to do?" she asked. Cole met her gaze. "I'm setting up signals around the property. If anything crosses the boundary, we'll hear it. I'll show you the pattern so you recognize the sound." Nomi swallowed. "What about inside? The windows, the doors?" "We'll reinforce them again today," Cole said, "and move the furniture away from the back walls. No one gets trapped." Lyra set her jaw, surprising the others with her firmness. "I can help with the horses. If something happens, they need to be calm." Cole nodded, appreciating her clarity. "Do that. Keep them ready but not restless." The group moved like a small unit now, each person knowing their role without needing elaborate instructions. Outside, Cole demonstrated how to string the wire between the fence posts. Taya held the posts steady while he wrapped the metal around them. Sonny followed behind, checking each connection, tugging lightly to test the tension. They placed small tin pieces along the line so they would rattle if disturbed. The work was slow but efficient. Every step brought the ranch closer to readiness. At the barn, Lyra brushed the horses again, but this time she spoke to them in a steady, low tone, telling them to stay calm, telling them she was there. The animals shifted restlessly at first, sensing the change in the atmosphere, but her calm presence anchored them. Nomi spent the morning boiling water and preparing a pot of thick stew. She tasted the broth twice, adding more herbs than usual, wanting the meal to be warm enough to lift everyone's spirits, at least for a moment. She didn't like feeling useless, and cooking was something she could do without trembling. By midday, the sky began to clear, though the cold stayed firm. Cole hammered the last stake into the ground and stepped back to assess their work. For the first time since the widows arrived, he allowed himself a brief exhale. Taya came up beside him, wiping dirt from her hands. "You're doing more than offering shelter," she said quietly. "You're preparing to protect us." Cole didn't look at her. His gaze stayed on the horizon. "I'm protecting the ranch," he said, "and you're part of it now." Taya held his words for a long moment, accepting them not as kindness, but as truth. Back inside, the stew filled the room with warmth. Everyone ate sitting closer together than before, the unspoken understanding that they were now tied to the same danger and the same safety settling between them. As the sun lowered behind the hills, Cole walked the perimeter one final time. No new tracks, no movement, no sound except the occasional groan of wood shifting under cold. When he returned to the house, Taya stood on the porch, waiting. She didn't speak at first. She simply looked at him, searching for any sign of doubt. He gave none. "The day didn't bring trouble," Cole said, "but that doesn't mean the night will be quiet." Taya stepped closer, her voice measured. "Whatever comes, we're not facing it alone anymore." For the first time since she had arrived, her eyes didn't carry defeat, they held readiness. Cole nodded once, firm and certain. The ranch had transformed from a lonely refuge into a line they would defend together. And as darkness spread across the land, none of them stepped away from that shared truth. A pale light pressed against the windows the next morning, though it brought no real warmth. The wind had shifted overnight, blowing colder air down from the northern ridge, bending the dry grass toward the creek and carrying a faint smell of distant smoke. Cole Rannick woke before the women again, the unfamiliar weight of responsibility pulling him quickly out of sleep. He sat up on the bedroll and listened to the house settle, wood groaning softly, embers cracking in the stove, quiet breaths from the far corner where Lyra and Nomi slept. He rose and stepped outside, boots landing silently on the frosted porch. The land ahead looked still, but stillness had taken on a new meaning now. He scanned the ridge lines with the sharpened instinct of someone who had once tracked dangerous men for weeks at a time. Nothing moved. No figures, no horses, no dust trails. But the smell in the air bothered him. It was faint but real. Not fire, not ranch smoke. Something else he couldn't place yet. Sonny appeared beside him moments later, pulling her coat tighter around her. She didn't say good morning. Her eyes were locked on the horizon the same way his were. "You smell it too," she said quietly. "Yeah," Cole replied. "Can't place it. Old campsites smell like that," Sonny said. "Ones used by men who move constantly." Cole didn't respond. He didn't need to. Her words matched his own suspicion. Inside the house, Nomi stirred awake, rubbing the sleep from her eyes as the stove warmed her cheeks. She went straight to boiling water again, her fingers steadier than earlier days. Cooking had become her way of grounding herself, and today she worked faster, sensing tension in the air even without hearing the conversation outside. Lyra slipped outside with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't speak at first, instead watching the horses, who shifted nervously as she approached. The geldings snorted sharply, stamping the ground. Lyra ran a calming hand down its neck, whispering steady words in her language until its breathing leveled out. Her calm mattered. The animals responded to it more than anything else. Taya joined Cole last. She stepped onto the porch with her arms crossed tightly, her jaw set. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew something was off from the way the air felt against her skin. "What direction?" she asked. Cole pointed toward the northern ridge. Something burned there. Not a wildfire. Too cold for that. Something controlled. Taya scanned the ridge in long, calculated sweeps. "He's signaling," she murmured. Cole turned his head slightly toward her. "Signaling who?" Taya lowered her eyes, the truth difficult to say. "He travels with 2 men now. They weren't with him in the beginning. They joined later, After things turned worse. Sonny stepped closer. They owe him favors. He saved one of them from a raid years ago. They follow him without question. Cole processed that silently. 3 pursuers changed the situation. Not impossible to handle, but far more dangerous for a small ranch with 4 exhausted women inside. "We need a plan," Cole said. "We've been making one," Taya replied. "Just not out loud." They gathered inside around the table, where a pot of oats simmered quietly. The room felt smaller than usual, not from fear, but from the weight of decisions they could no longer postpone. Cole laid out a rough map of the property he had drawn years ago, its corners worn from folding. Sonny leaned over it, tracing the ridge line with her finger. "They'll come from here," she said. "He likes high ground. He likes having a clear approach." Cole nodded. "I'll take the north. If he comes down the slope, I'll see him first." Nomi shook her head immediately. "Not alone," she said, voice trembling but firm. "You don't know how he works." Cole raised an eyebrow. Nomi rarely spoke with such certainty. Taya stepped in. "He doesn't aim for the strongest first. He looked for the isolated one. He hits the weakness, not the front." Cole's expression hardened slightly, not in anger, but in recalibration. "Then we stay grouped. No one moves out of sight." Lyra spoke next, her voice quiet but steady. "What if they try to corner the horses? They might spook them intentionally." Cole pointed to the barn on the map. "We'll move the animals inside and bar the door from the inside out so they can't get in easily." Everyone nodded. The plan became clearer as they talked. Taya and Sonny would watch the west and north windows. Nomi would prepare water and blankets in case they needed to retreat deeper inside. Lyra would calm the animals and help secure the barn. Cole would reinforce the porch rail and set a second barricade behind the front door. Once the plan was agreed upon, they each moved immediately. New scenes unfolded around the ranch. Cole nailed heavy boards across the lower porch railing, driving each nail with force controlled enough not to split the wood. Taya checked the shutters again, pulling the metal hooks tighter. Sonny marked escape paths around the house, making sure no one tripped on loose stones or debris. Nomi filled every container with water, not knowing if they'd need it for drinking, for washing wounds, or for dousing a fire. Lyra led the horses into the barn and talked to them softly until they relaxed. By afternoon, the ranch no longer looked like a lonely home. It looked like a place ready to withstand trouble. When the sun finally dipped, the sky turned a deep violet, and the cold grew sharper. Cole stepped outside, one last time to look at the ridge. A single thin column of smoke rose from far away and faded into the wind. Taya came up beside him, her breath visible in the cold. "He's telling us he's close." Cole didn't blink. "Good. Then I know where he is." Taya studied his face for a long moment. "You don't need to do this for us." Cole looked at her with quiet clarity. "This isn't only about you anymore." Her breath caught slightly at the honesty in his tone. Not romantic, not dramatic, simply true. Inside the house, the lanterns glowed softly. The women moved quietly, mentally preparing for the night ahead. Cole stepped back onto the porch and closed the door behind him. The ranch held steady under the darkening sky. The waiting had begun, and every person inside understood it clearly. Whatever was coming would reach them soon, and none of them were leaving the ranch unprotected. The night passed without an attack, but the silence it carried felt unusually heavy, as if every sound in the valley had been pressed down by an unseen hand. By dawn, the air had turned sharper, colder than any morning since the widows arrived. Frost clung to the corral posts in thick white lines, and a thin mist hovered low across the ground like breath trapped against the earth. Cole Rannick woke to the faint groan of wood shifting under the temperature drop. He moved quietly across the room, pulling on his coat, and stepped outside. The sun had barely begun its rise, and the sky was a mix of pale blue and dull gold. He scanned the ridge automatically, expecting movement, a shadow, a horse, anything. But once again, the hills stayed motionless. It wasn't comforting. Inside, Taya sat near the stove, already dressed, her expression drawn tight with calculation. She didn't appear tired despite the restless night. She appeared focused, ready to understand what new daybreak meant for their situation. Sonny sat on the opposite side of the room, sharpening a small blade she had found in Cole's toolbox. Her movements were slow and consistent, revealing a person who had prepared for survival long before reaching this ranch. Nomi stirred a pot of warm water, trying to conceal the tension in her face, but her fingers gave her away. They curled tightly around the handle of the ladle with each stir. Lyra fed the fire, nudging the wood deeper into the flames, her quiet breath forming brief patches of fog in the light. Cole walked in, shutting the door behind him. "No movement yet," he said. He didn't add reassurance, because reassurance without facts had no place here. Taya stood. "He's waiting for us to relax," she said. "He wants us tired, nervous, slow." Cole didn't disagree. "Then we don't give him that." Sonny placed the sharpened blade on the table. "We should know the land well enough now. If he comes from the north, we use the porch barricade. If he circles behind us, the barn door will hold long enough for us to move." Nomi stepped closer, worry tightening her expression. "What if he brings more men than you expect?" Cole met her gaze calmly. "Then we adjust. But we don't panic." Lyra finished feeding the fire, then brushed ash from her hands. "The horses are alert. They're listening. They'll warn us if something gets too close." Taya approached Cole with steady eyes. "What's your plan for today?" Cole walked to the table and unrolled the old property map again. "We keep preparing, but we also need a vantage point. If I can get clear visibility from higher ground, I'll know exactly where he is." Sonny's brows drew together. "You want to climb the ridge?" "Not the top," Cole replied. "Just high enough to see what's coming." Nomi's breath caught. "Alone?" Cole nodded. "It's quicker that way." Taya stepped forward immediately. "I'm going to." Cole shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It is for us," she said. "He doesn't know your habits. He knows ours. He knows how we move. If you miss a sign, I won't." Cole held her gaze for several long seconds. Taya wasn't being reckless. She was being realistic. She understood the man hunting them in ways Cole couldn't, and he needed that insight if he was going to protect the ranch. "All right," Cole said, "but we move carefully. No open ground unless we need it." Sonny looked at Taya with concern, but didn't argue. She knew Taya wouldn't be persuaded out of joining. Lyra handed Taya a shawl for warmth. "Come back," she whispered. "We will," Taya said. The two stepped outside, heading toward the north ridge. They walked behind the barn to avoid open sight lines. The wind brushed against them in steady gusts, carrying the smell of cold stone and drying grass. Cole stayed slightly ahead, scanning the terrain with the precision of someone who had once relied on reading landscapes for survival. Taya kept pace easily, her eyes shifting between the ground and the trees. She pointed out subtle signs, broken twigs, faint depressions in the dirt, a snag of fabric caught on a low branch. Cole would have missed the fabric. It was small and nearly colorless. But Taya saw it instantly. "Someone passed recently," she said. "Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to watch." Cole tightened his grip on his knife. "How far would he stay?" "He likes distance," she answered. "He watches until he's sure no one is ready." They climbed carefully, stopping every few steps to listen. When they reached a low ridge ledge, Cole crouched behind a large rock and motioned for Taya to stay low. The land ahead opened into a wide stretch of forest and narrow ravines. They scanned every inch. "There," Taya whispered, pointing to a spot deeper in the trees. A small flicker of movement. Not much, just a shift of fabric through branches. Cole saw a figure kneeling, adjusting something on the ground. The angle was steep, but Cole recognized the posture of a man preparing a camp or setting markers. "He's marking his path," Taya whispered. "He's planning to come closer when he chooses." Cole's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from the clarity of knowing the threat's exact direction. "We go back," he said. "We know what's coming now." Taya didn't move immediately. She watched the man a moment longer, her face tight with old emotion. Then she nodded and followed Cole downhill. When they reached the ranch, the women waited on the porch. None of them spoke until Cole and Taya were close enough. "You saw him," Sonny said. "Yes," Cole replied. "He's north. He's not rushing, but he's close." Nomi's eyes filled with dread. Will he attack today? Cole answered with certainty. Not today. He's setting the ground first. Taya added, but he's closer than before. He wants us cornered. Lyra stepped forward. Then we don't panic. Taya looked at her with surprised respect. Cole exhaled, long and controlled. We'll be ready. We're not losing ground. Not here. The group moved back inside as the wind grew harsher, rattling the roof. Every person carried a new understanding now. The danger wasn't distant anymore. It had shape, direction, and intention. And Cole knew, more clearly than ever, that the final encounter was no longer a possibility. It was approaching, step by deliberate step. A thin gray dawn crept over the valley, flattening shadows and revealing every shape with firm, steady light. Cole Rennick stepped onto the porch the moment the horizon brightened, his coat pulled tight against the cold. The wind had softened sometime during the night, leaving the air unnervingly still. No birds called, no brush shifted. The land held a silence that demanded attention. Inside the house, the women stirred one by one. After days of tension, each of them sensed a difference the moment they woke. Something had shifted, not in danger, but in decision. They were done running. The ranch was no longer a temporary stop. It was a place they had chosen to stand. Sonny tied back her hair with a firm knot, her movements steady. She placed the small blade she had sharpened the day before in her waistband, not out of fear, out of readiness. Nomi folded blankets neatly and cleared the table, her hands steady for the first morning since arriving. She wasn't trembling anymore. Survival had given her a reason to find her composure. Lyra went to the barn early, guiding the horses out into the yard to let them stretch. Their movements were calm today, not restless. Animals sense conflict before people did, and today they sensed something else, resolution. Taya stepped outside last. She found Cole standing near the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on the ridge where they had seen the figure the previous day. She studied his face, looking for tension. Instead, she found quiet certainty settling across his expression. He'll move today, Taya said. Maybe, Cole replied. But we're ready now. There was no fear between them, only clarity. They gathered around the table to eat a simple breakfast. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed. When they finished, they each moved to their assigned places around the ranch. Cole took the porch, the closest point to the north. Taya positioned herself near the kitchen window. Sonny watched the west fence line. Nomi stayed inside with blankets and water ready. Lyra stood near the barn doors, calming the horses with her presence. Hours passed. The sun rose fully, warming the frost until water dripped steadily from the fence rails. Nothing moved along the ridge. No figures appeared. No smoke trails formed. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. He kept scanning. Patience was a survival skill he had learned long ago. Fights were often decided by who stayed calm the longest. Around midday, Taya joined him briefly on the porch. She carried 2 cups of warm water, steam lifting faintly from the rims. He's waiting for us to break our pattern, she said, handing him one. Cole took a slow sip. Then we don't break it. She stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. For the first time since she set foot on the ranch, her expression held a small trace of peace, as if she finally trusted the ground she stood on. Minutes turned into an hour. The ridge remained empty. Sonny approached cautiously. Either he's gone, or he's not coming. Taya shook her head. He's not the type to walk away. Cole continued studying the hills. But something had changed. He could feel it. The land no longer held the sharp tension from days before. It felt grounded, settled, almost relieved. Then, in the far distance, a single rider appeared. Not close, not approaching, simply moving along the ridge line with slow, deliberate steps. Cole lifted the rifle slightly, not to fire but to confirm what he saw. The rider didn't stop. He didn't look their way. He kept moving south, down a trail that led away from the ranch entirely. Sonny's eyes widened. Why would he leave? Taya exhaled slowly, understanding settling into her expression. He watched long enough to realize we're no longer prey. He doesn't fight people who stand together. He only hunts people who fall apart. Cole stepped back, lowering his rifle fully. The rider grew smaller and smaller until the figure vanished behind the last ridge. It was over, not with gunfire, not with shouting, but with a man realizing his intended victims had become a force he didn't want to challenge. Taya leaned her hands on the railing, breathing deeply. I never thought he'd walk away. He did, Cole said, because you faced him with something stronger than fear. She looked at him, her gaze steady. Not alone. The others gathered slowly, Nomi wiping her hands on her skirt, Lyra smiling faintly as the horses relaxed, Sani letting out a long, controlled breath she had held for years. Inside the house, the tension that had lived in every corner for days began to dissolve. The space felt lighter, warmer, lived in. Cole turned toward the group. "This place is safe now," he said quietly. "You can stay for as long as you want. No one here will chase you out." Nomi covered her mouth briefly, overwhelmed by relief. Lyra stepped closer, nodding with real gratitude. Sani stood straighter, pride replacing old fear. Taya walked toward Cole slowly, each step more grounded than the last. She stopped in front of him, searching his expression for doubt or hesitation. "You're sure you want us here?" she asked. Cole didn't look away. "I'm sure this ranch hasn't felt alive in years, and I don't want to go back to how it was." Taya's eyes softened, not with sentimentality, but with a recognition of something she had long believed she would never find again: belonging. The others came closer, forming a small circle around Cole. They weren't fugitives anymore. They weren't guests. They were home. By late afternoon, the fog lifted completely, revealing a bright, open sky. The ranch, once marked by loneliness, now held voices, movement, and the quiet beginnings of shared future. Cole and Taya stood side by side, watching the land they were now responsible for together. There were no doubts, no unsettled questions, no lingering shadows on the ridge. The threat was gone. Their fear no longer controlled them. The ranch had become a place of safety and rebuilding. For the first time in a decade, Cole felt something settle inside him with calm finality. This was his family now. Taya, Sani, Nomi, Lyra. For women who had found their strength again under his roof. And for the first time since the widows arrived, Taya allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Their lives had changed the moment they stepped onto this land. And now, their future, together, was certain, grounded, and peaceful.